Michael and his roommate Steve were heading to a fraternity party off campus. They were already in the Uber when Steve realized he'd left his phone charging on his bed back at the dorm. They decided it wasn't worth turning around. At the party, the two eventually drifted into different circles. The bass was thumping and Michael's pocket buzzed. He pulled out his phone. The caller ID read Steve. Confused, Michael answered. Through a heavy, rhythmic mask of static, he heard Steve's voice. It sounded distant, mechanical, but unmistakably his roommate. Steve said only 5 words, "Come back to the room." Then, the line went dead. Michael tried calling back immediately. No answer. He texted. No reply. He ordered an Uber and raced back to the campus. When he burst into their dorm room, the lights were off. Steve wasn't there, but sitting right where he'd left it, plugged into the wall on the bed, was Steve's phone. Michael picked it up. The screen lit up with 6 missed calls and frantic texts, all from Michael. There were no outgoing calls. None. When Steve finally walked through the door an hour later, he swore he hadn't touched a phone all night. He hadn't even been near one. Yet, Michael's call log showed a 15-second connection from Steve's number. The service provider couldn't explain it. There was no record of the call ever originating from Steve's side of the network. It was a conversation with a ghost using a device that never dialed. In 1970, 25-year-old Donna Lass was finishing her shift as a nurse at a casino's first aid station in South Lake Tahoe. She was reliable, the kind of person who didn't just vanish. But the next day, her boss received a call from an unidentified man. The voice was calm, almost clinical. He claimed Donna had a family emergency and would be out of town for a while. Her landlord received the same call. Suspicion didn't take long to surface. Donna's mother was contacted and she knew nothing of an illness or a trip. Donna's car was still parked in its usual spot, untouched. When investigators looked at her final logbook entry at the casino, the ink trailed off mid-sentence, the pen leaving a sharp scratch across the paper as if she'd been interrupted in the middle of a word. 6 months of silence followed until the San Francisco Chronicle received a postcard. It was from the Zodiac Killer. He didn't name Donna, but he hinted at a 12th victim buried in the Lake Tahoe area. Search parties combed the woods, but they found nothing. Some believe the Zodiac was just taking credit for a crime he didn't commit to stay in the headlines. If that's true, it means someone else snatched Donna from her desk. Someone who knew exactly how to mimic the social cues of a family emergency to buy themselves time. Her body has never been found. Brandon Swanson was 19 when he drove his car into a ditch on a gravel road in rural Minnesota in 2008. He wasn't hurt, just stuck. He called his parents, sounding frustrated but safe. For 47 minutes, he stayed on the line with them as he walked toward what he thought were the lights of the town of Linden. His father, Brian, listened to the crunch of gravel under his son's boots. They were trying to coordinate a meeting point, but something was wrong. Brandon couldn't see his parents' headlights, and they couldn't see him, even though they were exactly where he claimed to be. Suddenly, Brandon stopped talking about the lights. He shouted a single sharp profanity, "Oh!" The silence that followed was absolute. Brian screamed his son's name into the receiver over and over, but there was no response. The line remained open, but all the parents could hear was the wind. Despite one of the largest search efforts in state history, involving hundreds of volunteers and specialized K-9 units, they only ever found his car. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, and no sign of Brandon. That final "oh" remains one of the most haunting pieces of audio never recorded, the sound of a young man stepping out of this world and into something else entirely. A woman named Stacy once shared the ordeal her brother faced regarding a series of calls that defied logic. Every night, like clockwork, between 2 and 3 a.m., his phone would ring. If he answered, he heard a sound he described as hellish, a thick, wet static, layered with what sounded like distant, distorted screaming. He changed his number. Within a week, the calls returned. He changed providers. They followed him again. One night, fueled by a mixture of rage and sleep deprivation, he dialed the number back. An old man answered, sounding sleepy and genuinely confused. He had no record of making a call. Later, he called back again and reached a completely different person in a different state. The calls eventually followed him to his mother's house, appearing on her landline after his own phone had been disconnected due to the stress of losing his job. When they called the number back that time, a recorded message informed them the number was disconnected. It was a closed loop of harassment that seemed to have no physical origin, a haunting that existed only within the wires and the airwaves. In the 1980s, Bashir Kouchakji, a successful restaurant owner in Washington, D.C., found himself the target of a psychological war. It began with phone calls, hundreds of them. The caller was nicknamed l'enfant, or the child, because the voice would often shift into the high-pitched whine of a young girl. This wasn't just a prank. It was a siege. The caller knew everything. They knew when Bashir's wife was pregnant. They knew the layout of his restaurant. They knew when he traveled. When Bashir fled to Philadelphia to stay with his sister, the calls were waiting for him there before he even checked in. His Mercedes was keyed with religious symbols. He eventually suffered a nervous breakdown and checked himself into a psychiatric ward, thinking he was losing his mind. The FBI stepped in and put a trace on the lines. What they found was impossible. The calls were hitting Bashir's business from different payphones across the region so rapidly that it would have required a coordinated team of people moving in perfect synchronization. There was no motive. No ransom was ever demanded. No political agenda was revealed. It was a decade of systematic, orchestrated torture carried out by voices that vanished into the city streets the moment the receiver was hung up. In 1931, William Wallace, a soft-spoken insurance agent in Liverpool, received a message at his chess club. A man calling himself R.M. Qualtrough wanted to meet the following night to discuss a policy. The next evening, Wallace set out, meticulously following the directions to an address in a neighborhood called Menlove Gardens East. He searched for nearly 2 hours in the cold rain, asking residents and even a policeman for help. He eventually realized the address didn't exist. There was a Menlove Gardens north, south, and west, but no east. Frustrated, he returned home to find his front door locked. When he finally gained entry through the back, he found his wife, Julia, in the living room. She had been brutally beaten to death. The police immediately suspected Wallace, claiming he had made the Qualtrough call himself to create an alibi. But the timeline made it impossible. The call had been traced to a public booth near Wallace's home at a time when he was seen by multiple witnesses at the chess club. To this day, the impossible murder remains a classic cold case. The identity of the man who lured Wallace away with a phantom address remains a mystery, a voice from a booth that sent a man on a wild goose chase while his life was being destroyed at home. Jason Alexander's family used to get frequent calls for a woman named Tanya. They shared a common last name, so they figured it was just a wrong number in the directory. After they moved house and the world transitioned away from physical phone books, the calls stopped. Tanya became a forgotten footnote. 4 years later, Jason was driving home when he saw the flashing lights of a massive wreck near the entrance to his neighborhood. A car had veered off the road and wrapped itself around a signpost, the very post that displayed his house number. A few days later, the police called him. They weren't calling about the accident directly. They were looking for Tanya. Her registration was found in the wreckage, but the car was empty. There was no driver, no blood, and no sign of a struggle. The police had found Jason's old number in her belongings and were checking if she had arrived at his residence. She never did. The woman who had been a wrong number for years had finally arrived at his doorstep, only to vanish into the night at the moment of impact. In 1965, Judith Hyams disappeared from Florida, leaving behind a car with blood on the seats. It was suspected she had died during a botched illegal abortion, but the trail went cold for 25 years. Then, in 1990, the phone started ringing. A police captain in Coral Gables received a call from a radio host in Omaha who claimed to have information. When the captain called back, the host was baffled. He had never made the call. Then came another call from someone claiming Judith was alive and living under an assumed name. Then a third from a man claiming to be an informant. These weren't just random tips. They were specific, detailed, and completely untraceable. They rejuvenated a case that had been dead for a quarter century, forcing the police to look back into the shadows of the 1960s. But like all these stories, the voices provided no closure. They only added more layers to the static. Technology often acts as a mirror for things we aren't meant to see. In 2021, a young woman named Clara began receiving FaceTime requests from her own contact card. When she'd answer, the screen would be black, but she could hear the sound of someone breathing heavily, her own rhythm of breath. She'd watch the screen, and for a split second, a flash of her own living room would appear, but from an angle where no camera existed. She'd see the back of her own head on the screen, sitting on the couch, holding the phone. Every time she turned around, the room was empty. This went on for 3 nights until she finally moved out. The calls stopped, but she still refuses to look at her phone's reflection in the dark. A security team at a decommissioned children's hospital in the UK reported a strange glitch in their digital intercom system. At 3:14 a.m., the system would activate in the old oncology ward. No one was there. The wing was gutted and scheduled for demolition. Through the speakers in the security hub, they would hear a child's voice asking for a glass of water and the blue book. When they checked the archives, they found a patient record from 1974. A young boy had died in that exact ward at 3:14 a.m. His last request to the night nurse? A glass of water and his blue coloring book. The intercom system hadn't even been installed until 1998. The wires were carrying a request from a decade they weren't even built to understand. We live in a world tethered together by invisible signals, millions of voices crossing through the air every second. We trust that we know who is on the other end. But as these stories show, the line between a connection and a haunting is thinner than we think. If you want to make sure your phone doesn't start ringing with voices from the past, you might want to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It's the only way to stay tuned to the truth before the static takes over. Sleep well if you can, and tell me in the comments, have you ever answered a call that felt like it came from somewhere else?